Welcome back to the 2024 SAR Colloquium Series. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Before I start, before I introduce today's speaker, a couple of things. Firstly, I want to thank our sponsors for this event, and those include the Patricia Foshi Charitable Fund, Adobo Catering, the Mellon Foundation, the Palahamo Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. We will have our next colloquium in this series 2 weeks from today, same place, same time, and that will be Fiori Berhane presenting a talk titled Present Interruptus, Sovereignty's Reincarnation in the Golan Heights. So that will be on Wednesday, November 6th. Please be here. I'm really excited about today's talk, and thank you for coming. Today's speaker is Professor Fiori Berhane. She is this year's Wenner-Gren Fellow, and she is also an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Southern California. Dr. Berhane received her PhD in 2021 from Brown University, Department of Anthropology, and her work has been published in Cultural Anthropology, Migration and Society, Anthropology Now, Allegra Laboratory, Africa is a Country, and Lavoro Culturale. And she has been supported by the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the Fulbright IIE, and the American Academy in Rome. That's very impressive for someone who's really just starting her career. So, wow. Today, Dr. Berhane will be speaking about the work she's doing here at SAR this year, and her talk is titled Prisoners of Our Dreams, Eritrean Diaspora Politics in Red Italy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiori Berhane.
Thank you, Paul, for the kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who's here with me today. I'm very excited to share some of the work that I've been doing here at SAR. And thank you, Paul, because I struggle to toot my own horn. So I hope to, I'm grateful that you tooted it for me. So, and before I start, I just want to say that all of the images I share have a rich history behind them. I don't necessarily have time to describe that history in the talk, but during Q&A, I invite questions. So I would first like to begin this talk by extending my gratitude to the SAR and, of course, to the Wenner-Gren Foundation, which endowed this fellowship, and they endowed my fellowship as a graduate student, the Fulbright and the American Academy in Rome. I do this because I would probably forget if I left it to the end. I would also like to thank my mentors at Brown and my colleagues at USC, as well as the new friends with whom I've had generative conversations here at the SAR. I have to include my family here, whose stories of revolution, war, and colonization stoked my curiosity. My parents are refugees from Eritrea. And importantly, how their experiences drove my commitment towards realizing a better world. My youngest sister in particular, Bethlehem, whose humor and sense of justice make my life brighter and my work a bit more bearable. And to my interlocutors who, despite having the odds stacked against them, showed tremendous tenacity and hope in shaping another possible world. So today I will give an overview of the project that has in some ways consumed my life for the better part of a decade, if you can believe that. I can't. I first started my fieldwork in 2015 during the summer of the crisis of migration in Bologna, Italy. And I picked Bologna I picked Bologna because it was once considered the capital of Eritreans in exile. The communist administration there, which is where the red comes from, Rosso, aided the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and had a festival that lasted from 1974 to 1991. I'm not going to go over that history today, I'm going to talk about a different aspect of the project that I've been working on. So first I would like to begin with a quote from Gat, who's a 15-year-old refugee encamped in Calais. It's the informal transit camp at the border between France and the United Kingdom, and from which the title of my forthcoming book project begins. So Gat says, "We constantly struggle for freedom, dignity, safety, and a better future. Then we become prisoners of our dreams. Some of us will want to search for the meaning of hope and the conviction that something will turn out well, with the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. This harrowing step-by-step journey to Europe leaves many of us crushed by laws, with no hope but to evade power. But we keep struggling and dreaming, so we are alive." So this quote comes from a 15-year-old refugee from Eritrea. And Eritrea, as I'll talk about, is one of the largest per capita producers of refugees in the world. Something I think, first of all, I don't think many people know where Eritrea is. I'm hoping some do. But today I will talk about its political crisis and how Eritrean refugees engage with one another and with a politics of migrant rescue. So in my book, I argue that Eritrean migrations to Italy have been enfolded in larger questions around the colonial past and the post-colonial present. In the book, I employ the concept of disjunctive memory work as a political practice, both as a political practice my interlocutors deploy, which means bringing in pasts that have been dislocated from one another, and how these and an analytic that I use to make sense of multiple unassimilated pasts. The colonial past between Eritrea and Italy and its post-colonial reverberations, and the Eritrean revolutionary movement. I look at how these pasts are activated by activists and state actors and and how this determines the shape of human mobility for years to come. Yes. As I've written elsewhere, Italy and Eritrean migrations have become laboratories for migration deterrence policies writ large. So as a political and legal anthropologist, I've done research with Eritrean refugees of disparate political generations, the generations that came before, the generations from the 1970s onward, and those who came in the 2000s. So most of my time in Italy was spent with Eritrean activists, and here are the routes, the journeys that many of them take. Like Jat, they left Eritrea, they disembarked from Tripoli through the Mediterranean and arrived in Italy in difficult circumstances. Indeed, many of those who've been arriving on Italy's shore come from Eritrea. In 2015, 60,000 Eritreans arrived through the central Mediterranean route, which is known as the world's most dangerous migrant route. They were only second to Syrians as one of the largest populations to arrive to European shores during the summer of the migration crisis. They've been one of the largest groups to transit through the central Mediterranean until the 2017 treaty memorandum of understanding between Italy and Libya that the government signed to reduce the number of arrivals. Eritreans' motivations, subjectivities, and circumstances are largely invisible with regards to the larger discursive representation of this crisis. Yet they're hyper-visible to EU authorities anxious to reduce the numbers of refugees from the Horn of Africa. Each month, anywhere from 2,000 to 7,000 Eritreans leave to find refuge elsewhere. And this is similar to the number of Syrians who were leaving during the height of Assad's war. The remarkable aspect is that Eritrea is a country of 5 million people. Syria, I believe, is over 20 million people. And that this is an unprecedented exodus for a peacetime country. Many of these young people, over 90% of whom are under the age of 24, embark on long and difficult journeys across the Sahara and the Mediterranean to reach Europe. In Libya, they are subject to a vast kidnap, extortion, and detention industry. So to set the backdrop for the chapter I will discuss, I will give a quick overview of Eritrea's colonial and post-colonial history. So first, this is an image from fascist propaganda of the 1930s. Behind the Italian soldier is an Eritrean askaro. These were colonial soldiers. During the time, almost the entire male population of Eritrea was conscripted as colonial soldiers, a fact that is, doesn't really register in public memory in Italy. But I just wanted to highlight this part first. So Eritrea was founded in 1890 as Italy's first colony. After Italy's defeat in World War II, Eritrea was put under British trusteeship from 1941 to 1951. In 1952, the territory was federated to Ethiopia. Under the leadership of Haile Selassie, Ethiopia forcibly annexed the territory in 1961. Eritrean groups from the Eritrean Liberation Front to the Eritrean People's Liberation Front waged a 30-year-long war, which was the longest in African history, against successive Ethiopian regimes. Close to 1/3 of Eritrea's population was dispersed in exile as a result of that war. Subsequently, the EPLF, now the current ruling party as the Party for Democracy and Justice, included its diaspora in this project of nation building from exile. In 1993, under a UN-mandated and monitored referendum, Eritrea gained statehood, with 98% of Eritreans at home and abroad voting in favor. But Eritrea's recent post-war history hasn't lived up to the promises of the liberation movement. Currently, Eritrea is one of the fastest depopulating countries and the largest per capita producer of refugees in the world today. Young people leave Eritrea in response to mandatory indefinite military service, forced labor and government development projects, extrajudicial killings, torture and arbitrary detention and violence. Out-migration is sanctioned by the regime through heavy penalties levied against the family of military deserters, as well as a shoot-to-kill policy on the border. The United Nations has charged the Eritrean regime, presently headed by Isaias Afwerki, with possibly committing crimes against humanity. Yet remittances and the 2% tax collected on diasporan Eritreans constitutes close to 30% of gross domestic product, indexing the paradoxical and extortionary relationship ruling elites have towards continued out-migration. So today I'm going to read excerpts from what I've actually been writing while here at SAR. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at the question of kinship, long a concern for anthropologists, right? And how the Eritrean government's co-optation of kinship networks interrelates with questions of migrant solidarity in the Mediterranean. So I'm going to be analyzing Eritreans' activism, which includes aiding refugees in transit, during the summer of 2015 by focusing specifically on the concept of political friendship offered by Derrida. So Derrida will haunt these halls again. In the chapter, I ask broader questions like, what kind of relations are possible under the long arm of authoritarianism? How do people enact non-deterministic futures in the shadow of failed revolutions and post-colonial devolution? And more simply, for whom do we act towards a better world? Here I enter with my interlocutors. Okay, so I'll begin with a quote from Derrida. For to love friendship, it is not enough to know how to bear the other in mourning. One must love the future. And I begin with my interlocutor, Michael. Our biggest problem is that there isn't trust between us, and that this lack of trust exists within families. Michael observed as he took a drag of his hand-rolled cigarette. Michael was a 36-year-old refugee who had lived in Italy for the past decade. He was also a recognized activist and raconteur. Known for his charm and wit, Michael created YouTube videos on the depredations of military service in Eritrea. Michael spent that hazy afternoon in July with me describing the contradictions within the Eritrean community, one in which political loyalty trumps other forms of affiliation. Speaking of a hypothetical Eritrean subject loyal to the regime, Michael continued with our conversation. Does he want a passport? Does he want to return to see his parents? You speak loudly, you get a reputation. And then the embassy hears things like, Michael's always criticizing the country. For Michael, it was clear that much of Eritreans' party loyalty was transactional, that the party state that had once achieved independence now gave passports and entry and exit papers solely to those who demonstrated fealty to the state project under the EPLF PFDJ. In other words, to return home to see one's family, one was required to demonstrate allegiance to the nationalist project. Seeking asylum, Eritreans enter into a vast network of cross-border relationships, institutions, and policies that has long been controlled by the EPLF, PFDJ. The state mobilized people's transnational affiliations and attachments against them, sowing distrust. Michael linked this distrust to the pervasive presence of Eritrean state agents abroad. Let's you and I go to one of these community festivals. Government agents will be there quietly filming. Look at Michael. He fled, and now he sides with the regime. They'll cause everyone to fight each other. Like other long-distance authoritarian regimes, the Eritrean government uses consulates, embassies, and other governments to gather intelligence on citizens abroad. In Michael's estimation, not only did the regime surveil and intimidate dissidents and supporters alike, but surveillance is meant to stir up division and political rancor, and in the process, undermining trust. This was especially the case amongst activists who may see that video and begin to doubt Michael's commitment to their shared cause, or may start to believe that Michael himself was actually an agent of the state. More importantly, it is only within a context in which people know who Michael is that a video could jeopardize his intimate relationships and serve to shore up state power. Indeed, intimacy, deep interdependency, and distrust all characterize the Eritrean diaspora. Moreover, surveillance isn't solely top-down and state-centric within diaspora. It permeates all aspects of social life, as Michael's remark about acquiring a reputation refers to. Eritreans face not only what is known as low-tech surveillance, but intimate surveillance from the state and diaspora. Indeed, surveillance's power here rests on the intimate, on its capacity to sow distrust even within families. Someone who knows Michael would have to report him to authorities in the first place for Michael to acquire a bad reputation. Nevertheless, there were few material benefits to surveilling on neighbors and intimates beyond avoiding punishment. Surveillance instead reflects the murky in-between of belief and coercion. As Michael remarks, the regime has made it so that there's very little separation between the government and people themselves. Michael was suggesting that political conviction trumps all forms of relationality, reducing the person to an individuated and atomized subject of and to the state. Michael and other activists cited this lack of separation as one of the core obstacles to organizing. Politics and personhood were so deeply wedded together by duress that coming together to contest the PFDJ's hegemony proved difficult. Eritreans also experienced surveillance and criminalization by the European Union and the Eritrean state, which both seek to stop human smuggling by targeting this highly mobile refugee population. In Italy, anti-trafficking and anti-smuggling prosecutions have targeted Eritrean families, with devastating consequences for the individuals and families ensnared in these prosecutions, including imprisonment, subsequent deportation, and possible loss of citizenship status. Moreover, the current restrictive migratory context has proven beneficial to PFDJ cadres in exile who manipulate asylum systems in receiving countries to maintain control of exile communities. Indeed, Eritrea is actually one of the paradigmatic examples of long-distance authoritarianism, which refers to how authoritarian regimes actually maintain control of their immigrant populations. I think there was a recent story of the assassination of the Sikh leader in California that the Indian government conducted. But fostering collective action and friendships was not impossible, though it took time. Michael initially believed that rational persuasion on a one-to-one basis could change people's political convictions. Then he began to realize that he needed to create grassroots political organizations. Michael realized that in voicing his opposition alone, he was likely to be isolated and cut off from the community. This isolation, as Michael observes, fed into processes of individuation and anomie that the regime cultivates. I've made many mistakes. I'd go to the bar, I would be against the regime. The next person to me would be pro-regime. We'd argue, and then we'd leave the bar, and nothing changes. Not unlike American politics. He explains how he and others came to join the group Eritrean Youth Salvation Network. So you see Teddy, he's just like me, and he has also done his service. Teddy ran away. He went to the camp in Ethiopia. Then he came to reunite here with his family. So he and I just started having conversations, and we realized that there were opposition groups in the United States. We thought to ourselves, why aren't there opposition groups here? There are no opposition groups in Bologna. There were opposition groups in Rome, but at first it was just 8 of us who wanted to speak out. Some were afraid. By looking to the examples of others, activists in the United States and in other Italian cities, Michael and others were motivated to start their own group in Bologna. Politics for Michael was an iterative process. One makes mistakes and learns from those mistakes. For Michael, finally coming together with others who shared similar beliefs and experiences was the precondition for political action. But that required that activists trust one another. Despite pervasive mistrust, Michael's activism came out of his friendship with like-minded others. It is important to note that similar circumstances, exile, political violence, and political generations could not fully account for diasporan political subjectivities. Indeed, as Michael makes clear, there were only 7 other people with whom he could organize with, as the stakes for activism were so high. Activism and friendship were difficult to separate. Beyond solely engaging with political activism, Michael and his friends planned each other's weddings, spent weekends socializing with one another, eating at restaurants owned by Eritreans sympathetic to their politics, and through parties and counter-festivals. How is it that in Michael's estimation, trust doesn't exist in families, and few friendships survive the political polarization common to the Eritrean diaspora, but 8 men previously unaffiliated with one another were able to build the trust necessary to engage in sustained political activism? One answer is that friendship is actually more important than kinship. Who'd think? In fact, a lack of trust within families emerged as a common theme amongst my interlocutors. Because kinship was liable to both state capture and instrumentalized by extra-legal actors like kidnappers and extortionists, friendships were equally, if not at times, more important to migratory and political projects. My interlocutors understood activism as a practice that could rebuild trust and hope, not amongst intimates, but amongst strangers. What can friendship offer analytically and politically when kinship has been co-opted? In this chapter, I reflect on Michael's life circumstances and their relationship to his political activism and to explore underexplored migratory processes. Attending to the alternative and contingent affiliations that sustained him and other migrants and refugees in high-stakes migration, I argue that friendship is central to the political activism of my interlocutors. It offers broader and analytical insights to studies of transnational migration in a world of wall and fences, and it illuminates the dynamics of living under the long-distance authoritarianism that characterizes the Eritrean diaspora. Eritreans experience kinship as part and parcel of state power. First, and Michael pointed towards, there's little separation between the government and people. Quote, the ruling class maintains kinship, friendship, or personal connections to the people, especially the most vocal and politically significant group in Eritrea, the Tigrinya speakers. State security agents may even be kin and are encouraged to spy on relatives. Kin networks are interpenetrated by state power from the outset. Moreover, the Eritrean state deploys violence against family members as a technology of political and coercive control in both Eritrea proper, actual territory, and its diaspora. And just to emphasize, almost 50% of Eritrea's population lives outside of the borders of Eritrea, which is the highest of any country. The state also exploits familial solidarity, not only by capturing the remittances I spoke of earlier, but through a range of practices that exploit the emotional bonds between family members, including, for example, denying children exit visas after the age of 6, so that their parents must either abandon their children to migrate or maintain ties to their children. Therefore, kinship ties have these ambiguous effects. While solidarity within families is necessary to survival under authoritarian governance, that solidarity nevertheless reifies state power. In Eritrean roles, for example, prisons, roles can change swiftly, with those formerly imprisoned now acting as guards and forced to torture their fellow cellmates. In this way, the regime produces complicity in which the lines between victim and perpetrator are purposely muddled. Moreover, imprisonment is a common experience for Eritreans. It is arbitrary and routine, yet invisible, taking place underground in converted grain silos and in unlit shipping containers. Nevertheless, despite the regime's growing autocratic tendencies, the state doesn't solely rely on coercion. For many in Eritrea proper and its diaspora, the state project under the EPLF-PFDJ is not only legitimate, but central to their lives and biographies. Therefore, political polarization within families is also a common reality and can lead to estrangement or, at worst, official censure. Notwithstanding Eritrean state co-optation of kinship networks, much scholarly literature on kinship has emphasized how kin networks endure despite state violence and consequently counter some of the negative effects of state power. Indeed, this has been the case in studies of migration more specifically. Much of the scholarly research on transnational families has focused on how kin networks endure despite distance and significant transformations to gender roles. Even following traumatic events like deportation, kinship ties remain. Moreover, it is kin networks that organize the resources that are necessary to high-stakes migration. Even though transnational families expend significant emotional and financial resources to maintain kin ties, the decision as to whose migratory project to support are pervaded by the inequalities within kinship relations writ large. There is a dark side to kinship. Kinship, as much as it is a site of solidarity and care, is also marked by economic, gendered, and race inequalities. At times, families reproduce these inequalities in who they decide is worthy of care and scarce resources. In medical anthropologist Shireen Hamdi's ethnography of organ transplantation in Egypt, Hamdi observes that, quote, organ transplantation can put unbearable pressure on vital family relations, often resulting in families having to choose gifts the kidney at the expense of whom. This dynamic of indebtedness and sacrifice applies equally to high-stakes migration. As authorized channels of movement diminish, migrants and refugees continue to rely on kinship networks to mobilize resources to undertake difficult years-long journey, often across multiple international borders. This reliance on networks creates enormous dependence upon those who have the resources to aid in materially costly journeys. Much like the concept of the free gift, which Mary Douglas points out is an oxymoron, deep dependence fosters resentment, as these kinds of gifts can rarely be reciprocated and instead harden existing inequalities. The Eritrean case instead demonstrates how kinship serves to reify state power. Eritrea's governance through kinship confounds any notions of biopolitical paternalism, as in a caring masculinist state, or nationalist myth-making based on shared sanguinity. Instead, the state was forged by the activities of guerrilla fighters and refugees who were either expected to sacrifice kin ties, in the former, or left family behind in the case of the latter. To be Eritrean, one must be willing to sacrifice for the state at any cost. In enforcing political loyalty, the state project depends on coercion and the instrumentalization of kin ties. It cares less about encouraging traditional notions of family and gender, as other right-wing authoritarian regimes have, or even their former state socialist counterparts. Instead, the state takes precedence over all other existing ties. By co-opting kinship, the state neutralizes organic solidarities, in process consolidating its hegemony amongst the diaspora community. Thus, autocracy's long arm depends upon the transnational family itself. First, even before Eritreans, so here I'll get into the details of how this co-optation takes place. Even before Eritreans seek refuge, they experience family fragmentation from the outset. Military service fragments families within Eritrea proper. Currently, individuals spend much of their adult lives as conscripts in the Eritrean Defense Forces, or laboring with little pay in national development programs. These programs dispersed individuals across the entire country under the logic that state-controlled migrations would allow people of different ethnicities to encounter one another, and in the process developed a pronounced sense of Eritreanness that transcends ethnicity, language, or religion. It's a multi-ethnic society with many languages, and Sunni Islam and Christianity are the dominant religions. Under national development projects, conscripts have few opportunities to visit family or to marry and start their own families, a condition Jennifer Regan terms limitless liminality. At times, entire families are conscripted to these programs. And so instead of national cohesion, the policy has been responsible for one of the largest and sustained refugee migrations in the last 2 decades. Disappearance is also another form of family fragmentation, and family members of those disappeared are barred from inquiring of the whereabouts of their imprisoned relatives, lest they be imprisoned themselves. Family fragmentation is such a common experience and often begins in Eritrea proper that high-stakes migration is a commonsensical response to conditions of imposed and institutionalized enemy. Second, the Eritrean state simultaneously encourages and punishes out-migration. Its mandated mass military conscription into military service and state developmental programs have not flattened social inequalities, as their architects may have intended. On the contrary, conscription and development projects have created an economic gulf between those who have family in diaspora, who are able to support their relatives left immiserated by this policy, and those who do not and cannot. Thus, for young people, the policy itself encourages migration, as migration becomes the only remaining tactic for family survival. Once these young people have successfully completed their migratory projects, the state then captures the remittances and 2% tax that these young immigrants send back. At the same time, the state fines families in Eritrea $3,300 for each child that absconds from military service. Sometimes it takes children younger than 18 years of age within the family in the place of the escapee. Children have borne the brunt of the state's developmentalist policies. Eritreans represent one of the largest number of unaccompanied child migrants arriving to the EU. That number keeps increasing year on year since 2010, despite the growing dangers. These policies put enormous strain on families. Throughout formal and informal conversations, those I spoke with emphasized that the decision to leave was often conducted in secret and discussed solely amongst trusted friends, as families were fearful of retributive state violence, economic devastation, and the deaths of their children that can result from these high-risk journeys. Nevertheless, these dynamics of sacrifice and indebtedness serve to keep immigrants tied to the EPLF-PFDJ, being able to return to Eritrea, send money to family members there, and engage with the diasporan community require engagement with the Eritrean embassy, which has been accused of surveilling and intimidating dissidents. Family fragmentation, therefore, did not mean that the family lost its symbolic and material significance, even if young people spent much of their lives separated from kin. Because of the increasing dangers associated with high-stakes migration, sending, receiving, and transit states surveil, extort, and criminalize the families of migrants. And this has been especially the case for Eritrean migrants, which I've written about, as well as my colleague Carla Hung. Further, there is no long and arduous and requires substantial material, physical, and psychological resources often supplied by, at times, reluctant family members. Eritrean migrants spend significant portions of their lives in transits. These journeys can take up to a decade, if not longer. Milena Belloni describes the cosmologies of destination that fashions Eritrean migration's aspirations. For Eritrean migrants, many of whom are young single men, reaching countries like the United States and Canada is the end of their journeys. These journeys may include deportations and reroutings. For example, Eritreans in Israel were voluntarily deported to Rwanda and Uganda, a policy actually that the United Kingdom government adopted until it was recently deemed until the Labour government scrapped it. The policy was in place from 2013 until the Israeli Supreme Court ruled. Once deported to South Sudan, up through Sudan and Libya to finally reach Italy and other European countries. These transit countries are still full of danger. In Libya in particular, there are fewer guarantees that Eritrean refugees will survive their land and sea journeys. Even upon arrival and settlement in Italy, as Bologna notes, Eritreans are willing to, quote, gamble to reach the United States or Canada. The US is actually where the largest Eritrean diaspora community is, despite having secured refugee status. Eritreans experience protracted vulnerability and violence from state and non-state actors alike. Their search for refuge reflects the few remaining options migrants have as states simultaneously close authorized channels of movement and push for domestic hostile immigration policy. Kinship's co-optation, so it's not all sad, however, did not mean that intimate relationships were entirely foreclosed. Indeed, to engage in high-stakes migration requires trust. Refugees needed to trust smugglers, strangers, and friends made along the journey, as many of my interlocutors emphasized. Thus, these migrations also create new attachments and friendships that sustain refugees and mitigate against the disconnection, loneliness, and loss that attends high-stakes migration in an anti-refugee and anti-Black world. On a practical level, it was through the bonds of friendship that Michael and his fellow activists began their NGO. And in the direst of times, when young Eritreans transit through Libya, it is the voluntary yet obligatory bonds of friendship that keep people alive and hopeful that they can and must survive. In her ethnography of Central American migrants transiting through Mexico, Wendy Voigt describes the intimate economies of mobility that reveals the dialectics between global intimate relations and individual strategies at the local level. In sites of transit, like the countries of Central America or the Saharan Desert, migrants experience total exploitation as they become targets of predatory rackets. Nevertheless, Voigt's ethnography endeavors to account for the intimate yet ephemeral relationships that sustain migrants in sites of total exploitation, places in which migrants are reduced to commodities. Put simply, for Voigt, sociality endures even in spaces marked by radical dehumanization. More important, Voigt engages intimacy as an analytic that is not delimited solely to kinship, as migrants are absented people, cut off from existing social networks in their journeys. She understands intimacy as a non-determinative state that changes ephemeral relations into life-sustaining encounters, however temporary those encounters may be. These intimate moments arise out of the stark violence migrants face. Voigt writes that in a context of social exclusion, a warm embrace, even a handshake, could be a profound act of human connection. I look to friendship as an analytic that is inspired by Voigt's perspective on intimate economies, but departs from it in important ways. In emphasizing friendship, I draw attention to the concept's long association with politics. And further, by attuning to the political valences of friendship, I move away from Voigt's emphasis on dyadic togetherness, like couples, which emphasizes how migrants survive in a present marked by radical dehumanization. In doing so, I emphasize friendship's orientation towards the future. As the opening epigraph makes clear, to love friendship, one must love the future. Put simply, which is to acknowledge friendship's transformative capacities. Put simply, friendship can fundamentally alter social and political worlds. Notwithstanding its gendered valences, friendship and fraternity often go hand in hand. For Derrida, friendship represents turning towards difference, rather than enmity, which requires that friends close ranks against enemies. Moreover, in eschewing the fraternal or familial, Derrida understands friendship as the acceptance of the radical alterity of the other. Enmity is unfortunately a structuring sentiment in our current global political reality, marked by right-wing retrenchment. This is no less true within the contentious politics that characterizes the Eritrean diaspora. So here's where Arendt comes. For Arendt, on the other hand, friendship epitomizes a love that is uncorrupted by nationalist or totalitarian political dogma. Friendship, therefore, can transcend rigid political boundaries. Yet Arendt still acknowledges that, quote, friendship is not intimately personal, but makes political demands and preserves reference to the world. In Arendt's formulation, friendship's anti-dogmatic nature holds democratic life together in that it requires dialogue, which exemplifies the trust and openness to dialogue, without which human beings cannot hope to create a common world. Moreover, the ability to engage in acts of friendship, situated as they are in the particular, aligns with Arendt's conception of thought itself, in which one puts oneself in the minds of others. Thus, to engage in friendship, one needs to practice a form of politicized and situated empathy, a concept not dissimilar to the thick solidarity that Liu and Shang prefer. That got a little bit too academic. But bear with me, it is from my book. In this way, we can see how political friendship shares important similarities to political solidarities writ large. Friendship, like solidarity, has the capacity to transcend putative sameness. It is potent and potentially transformative. Nevertheless, friendship, like solidarity and kinship, has an uncanny doubleness. While solidarity can enable intersubjective recognition across difference, it can also be mobilized to scapegoat and harm, to reaffirm bonds through violent exclusion. Yet as slippery as friendship is, like solidarity, it reminds us that political action is situated within actually existing networks in historical time. My interlocutor's political activism was born of the friendships they maintained with one another. Thus, activism and friendship reinforce one another. And in acting as activists, they were able to draw on their own emotional and material bonds to aid similar others, Eritreans who share no kinship or intimate ties with activists. In turn, they were affecting the kind of amity that Derrida argues characterizes the radical democratic potential of friendship. Their emotional material needs for friendship, for the care, camaraderie, and togetherness that friendship supplies, came out from the conditions and contingencies of state, communitarian, and intimate abandonment. So in the following section, which should be my end, hopefully, do I have time? Okay. In the following section, I enter with my interlocutors who engage with aiding refugees in transit. In this section, I look towards the ethical and political stakes of helping Eritrean refugees. So in 2015, 39,000 Eritreans arrived in Italy, and only 730 remained there and applied for asylum. So that means people were being helped to cross international borders by kin and activists alike. Eritreans understood Italy as a country of transit. Families in Europe would often drive down to Sicily, where many Eritreans first disembarked, and picked up loved ones so that these asylees would be able to lodge asylum cases elsewhere, like Germany, Sweden, or the Netherlands, where Eritreans have been integrated as refugees since the 1980s. And these are countries that have robust protections for refugees and stronger economies. So I enter with Hagos. And hopefully Hagos and, okay. Hagos, unlike most Eritreans who aid kin, was an Eritrean refugee in his mid-30s who aided those in transit. Below, he describes the ethical and political stakes of assisting putative strangers. The stakes for activism in Italy are high because of the context of how difficult it is to survive as an immigrant in Italy. Also, the community does not help recent arrivals, and the Eritrean embassy encourages others not to help recent arrivals. People are secretly helping recent arrivals, but for me, I hope to help new people leave Italy because I don't want them to have the life that I have here, without papers and without work. I've been imprisoned by law, and if another Eritrean meets that fate, I want to help them escape it. So my goal is to make sure that they have somewhere to sleep, a life to live in a place like Sweden or Switzerland, a job, and they can build an opposition movement. The reason I do this is to underscore the fact that people no longer help one another in Eritrea. And if we can rebuild trust and mutual assistance, then I think to myself that the Eritrean who goes to wherever country will begin to help others as well. The sad fact is that there's only 10 of us who do this work. Despite the constraints Girmay faced as someone imprisoned by law, he worked to realize the potential of others' freedom. That freedom and Girmay's hopes that those who were once the objects of aid would aid others in turn is not guaranteed. Girmay's self-consciousness around this lack of certainty hinges on his use of the term I think, or io penso in Italian, which within the grammatical form contains the seed of doubt or uncertainty. In this way, working to realize others' freedom betrays what the future anterior of friendship, or Derrida will make another appearance, or what Derrida knows as the time of perhaps. And Derrida says, and there is no more just category for the future than of perhaps. Such a thought conjoins friendship, the future, and the perhaps to open onto the coming of what comes. That is necessarily to say in the regime of the possible, whose possibilizations must prevail over the impossible. I will explain Derrida. In other words, the future anterior assumes no clear teleology or linear chronology, as many utopic and emancipatory movements once did, and as revolutions, and especially the Eritrean Revolution, promised. Moreover, the time of perhaps allows for the possibility that others act in ways that one cannot control, and therefore that one accepts the other in their radical alterity. Therefore, aiding others was unlike relations of control or coercion, in which their aims and objectives remain open to the possibility of building new relationships and their political forms of action. So I'm going to continue with another I've skipped over. Caring for these cast-offs, another member of the NGO, meant instilling hope in a lost generation, the generation that came after independence as Georgia understood it. Georgios arrived in the 1970s. He worked as a skilled manual laborer for much of his adult life. Once a refugee himself, having experienced Ethiopia's brutal counterinsurgency, Georgios had found a way to make a life for himself in Italy. During our first meeting, he explained why he helped refugees in transit, an act that could lead to his prosecution as a trafficker, or was more banally illegalized as a form of facilitating illegal migration. We organize the children who've been kicked out. We give them hope, and that is what is important. We help them a little on their road or their journey. We are very few. We have little capacity, and we ourselves need help. We are doing something outside of the law. For Georgios, organizing the children who've been kicked out indicates an awareness of the things that I've just talked about. But this form of outreach is a first step towards reconstituting these children's personhood, in particular because these are people who have been left bereft of their families. Moreover, to refer to recent refugees as children and not youth, as is more common within activist circles when some, but not all, are legal minors, positions Georgia as part of an older generation whose duty it is to care for those who come after. Indeed, Georgios was known for the fact that he often helped young people who didn't have family who could support their migratory projects, or whose families abandoned them mid-journey. His phone number circulated widely amongst those transiting without support of their kin. Others, like Michael, who were closer in age to refugees and his historical experiences more closely resembled theirs, rarely use this language of generational debt. Giving hope, or in Tigrinya, which means tesfa, has multiple valences. Tesfa conveys a sense of self-efficacy, self-belief, which would appropriately mean hope in oneself, in one's capacity to accomplish something. Giving hope does many things at once. In a context like Eritrea, in which the state interpolates young people as docile subjects, giving hope as facilitating self-capacity exceeds common understandings of neoliberal subjectivity. Indeed, within this context, and as a practice that shares much with care, giving hope involves forms of non-reciprocal exchange. Children transiting are rarely able to reciprocate the kind of care they receive from Georgios. As they are transiting, they may never encounter Georgios ever again, nor does Georgios expect reciprocity in return. Giving hope is also non-material. One cannot quantify or clearly delineate what forms of care instantiate hope. For some, like Michael when he first arrived in Italy, Receiving a pair of pants from a stranger who eventually turned friend made him feel like, quote, a human being again. Hope then is intersubjective, and here is where its relationship to friendship comes into relief. As Jackson writes, the presence of a friend can reinforce one's self-belief as the uplifting of the spirit, a replenishment of the will, a resuscitation of hope. So, as I said, they experienced many terrible things, but these acts of care from putative strangers were necessary to countering the objection they were subjected to. Georgios, Michael, and others weren't strangers in the sense that Simmel defines as a subject free from entanglement in family and party interests, or as a social being whose relationship with the in-group stems from non-relation and human commonness. Instead, Georgios, Gormai, and Michael and other young refugees were bound together in a diaspora riven by political violence, war, and serial waves of displacement, in which Georgios could see and imagine himself in the position of recently arrived refugees. I'm almost finished. Indeed, Georgios explained to me that he began helping young people after his brother reported him to the Eritrean government for his seditious beliefs. Georgios' brother, a disabled veteran of the nationalist war, depended on Georgios for material support. His denunciation, whether conducted under duress or motivated by resentment stemming from this deep dependency, only served to strengthen Georgios' resolve in opposing the PFDJ. For Georgios, the denunciation was a revelatory moment, forcing him to reckon with what he described as the regime's brainwashing. Quote, if his own kin were willing to engage in such an act of political betrayal, Georgios reasoned, then the state project was, quote, corrupt from its beginning. From that moment forward, Georgios stopped returning to Eritrea, and as a result lost contact with his remaining kin. He also rescinded any claims to land or property he had there. Crucially, he stopped materially supporting his disabled brother. Ironically, in contesting the Eritrean regime's policies, Georgios enacted a similar kind of intimate sacrifice that was expected of people like his brother who had joined the EPLF in its clandestine era. Profoundly still, his brother's betrayal and Georgios' response to it points to the impossible set of conditions people find themselves in, caught between party allegiance and kin, or activist and alienation from existing social networks. This was a context of deep atomization, distrust, and social fragmentation. Therefore, by caring for young people who were abandoned, Georgios and others attempted to form relationality. Paradoxically, and at times troubling still, it was a distrust endemic within family and protected family separation that is common to Eritrean migrants that conditioned the possibilities for Michael and Georgios' political activism. And unfortunately, for the sake of time, I must stop here without a formal conclusion. Thank you for your patience. And I look forward to your questions. Oh, and then the next slide, if you're interested more about Eritrea, here are my, as I was taught, I have to toot my horn more often, if you'd be interested. Open access publications. So yes, thank you.
So I have the mic if anyone has questions, but we may have some from online as well, in which case maybe, Miriam, none yet. Okay, good.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm really glad you're here at SAR, and USC is really lucky to have you too. I have a very simple question. It's probably going to be like in the preface of your book, and then I have one comment, just kind of like a parallel with Central American refugee immigrant communities in California. And the first question is so basic. You end by telling us that Hagos and others are trying to help other Eritreans get to Northwestern Europe, to the US, but your title says La Rosa, or something about Bologna. You suggest at the beginning something about Bologna. So I wonder if you could just give us a quick primer about Italy's policy towards Eritreans. Does the colonial legacy claim go further in La Rosa than it does in Italy? That's one question. And then the comment is, I was struck when you're talking about really the fragmented ties among family caused by this kind of long arm of authoritarianism, how much that's an LA story with Central Americans. And if you haven't met her yet, you will meet Cecilia Menjivard, who wrote many years ago. Her first book is exactly about the emergence of these deep political rifts in transnational communities and families, the emergence of transactional relations because of this precarity, and we'll talk more about that. But it's really, I was struck by the parallels there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are exciting questions. So I started, this is actually a poster of an exhibition in 2018 of an Eritrean artist who, it's in Tigrinya and Arabic and Italian. The interesting point, so just to say this, Italy never, people call it a long decolonization or an aborted decolonization, but it never had decolonization with its colonies. They just ceased to exist after 1941. And this was actually like the policy of the Italian state, which engaged in this kind of large-scale campaign of structural forgetting. The colonies no longer exist. Eritrea, though, had this complicated decolonization and complicated politics because once Eritrea, once the independence movement started, the Eritrean Liberation Front started calling Ethiopia's occupation colonialism. And so, and I've written elsewhere that this, calling it colonialism wasn't really, in many ways, it functioned in the same ways as the Italian policies of structural forgetting did, that it displaced the colonial past onto Ethiopia, although the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia was a consequence of Italian colonialism. Like I'd shown, all of the soldiers who were conscripted into the Italian army were Eritrean. They were the same soldiers who were the foot soldiers for the expansion of the Italian Empire. So they were used in the, they were part of the pacification of Libya, the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, etc. And so that created this really deep resentment. And there were also geopolitics behind it. But Italy just was like, these people don't exist. This didn't happen. Or at best, this was only a consequence of fascism. This was bracketed to the moment of fascism. But Italian colonialism is contemporaneous with the Italian state. Like Eritrea became a colony soon after Italian unification. So in Bologna, you had, Italy used to have the largest communist party outside of a communist nation. And the city government, the communist administration, aided the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And there were all these like, Lelo Basso, who was a jurist. They were all kind of debating the question of Eritrean self-determination. But as I've written elsewhere, this kind of solidarity was predicated on also a misreading of the colonial past. And Italy had a role also secretly in encouraging Eritrean sovereignty and independence to maintain its role in its former colonies. Right now, so I have to speed this up, but Italy's migration policies, its deterrent policies, are actually based on colonial relations. So Italy signed, as part of a reparations package, deals with Libyan authorities in 2008 that gave them significant resources for migrant deterrence. They've just recently signed some agreements with Eritrea and Ethiopia, and then they also have an agreement with Albania, which was also an Italian colony, to outsource asylum seekers there, which is finding many, many problems in the Italian courts. But I think that's the shortest answer I can give to a complicated colonial history. I hope I've done it justice.
Along those lines, I have another thing that just came to mind, and that is the extent to which Catholic refugees and migrants get preference in Italy.
Yes. So actually so Italy never had any form of refugee recognition or asylum system until the 2000s after La Legge Martelli. So Eritreans came to Italy in the 1970s, and they weren't recognized as refugees as they would have been in the United States, Canada, or Germany. Instead, they came informally through Catholic networks, Catholic associations, labor, women as labor migrants, on scholarships, etc. So yes, it did make a difference, and the Catholic Church has an interesting history there, but I don't have time. Thank you.
We do have an online question from the chat. Tricia says, wonderful talk, Fiori. Can you say a little more about the weaponization of kinship through the regime's imprisonment and ransoming of relatives of people who migrate extra-legally?
Yes. So this is an article that I wrote for Cultural Anthropology. So Eritrean refugees have, and it was actually featured in the New Yorker. Eritreans are kidnapped at extraordinarily high rates, partly because they have family in diaspora, and ransoms can reach up to $50,000. So ransoming and kidnapping happens in transit areas like Central America and in the Sahara, but in Eritreans in particular, there's a kind of collusion between non-state actors in Libya and actually agents of the Eritrean state, or people who have loose connections, who also act in concert with extortionists. So in many ways, what this really tells you about is, it's not, I wouldn't call it biopolitics nor necropolitics, because it's really about holding people in this state of suspension and extracting as many material resources you can out of them, so that they're not valuable in death and they're not valuable in life, and they're valuable in a kind of in-between region between life and death. I hope that answers the question, but yes, there have been allegations that Eritrean generals are also part of this kidnap and extortion industry in Libya.
I've got a couple of questions in the order I see your hand, so.
Thanks. It seems like there are a mix of motivations in your talk, and I'm trying to sort them out. I think that mostly you're focusing on political motivations.
Yes.
But in the example you gave of the bar, you've got a person who is a political refugee, and you've got somebody who supports the current regime, which would seem to be an economic migrant. So is that a correct characterization? You've got a mix, some purely driven by economics, some by politics?
Well, so there have been critiques of, for example, people do write about that the binary between the refugee and the economic migrant is a false one, that you can't really disentangle politics from economy. But one thing I do have to say is that Eritreans have extraordinarily high refugee recognition rates, in the 90%, and the EU average and the US average is about 30-something%. At some point, there were efforts by the Danish government to try to label Eritrea's political crisis as an economic crisis, which has had actual political effects. And also the Eritrean regime actually calls people who abscond from military service economic migrants. So it's this kind of language that I try to avoid because of its politicization in this context, and how much that label economic migrant has been used by both European governments who want to stem this migration, as well as the Eritrean regime to deny the actual political conditions and human rights conditions the Eritreans face. But I would say that the reason economic immiseration exists is because of the political calculations of the Eritrean government, which has decided to put most of its population in indefinite enforced service to the state, no pay. You labor there from 18 to 50. Oh, and you experience terrible abuses at the same time.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. I'm also processing everything that you said because it was a lot.
Yes.
I'm an esthetician. I study a lot of skin anthropology literature, and there's a lot of, I know out of the late 1800s after the Civil War in America, there was a lot of literature coming out talking about the vitamin D deficiencies and the bone deformities that were happening because of the Black populations being inside rather than outside doing land labor. And so I would love to hear a little bit, I don't know if there's any reading or research you've done about the effects on people's health when they finally either settle or journey. And then the other question that I had too was, it was really, really jarring to hear about the fact that families are fined, yet they're trying to, folks who have left, trying to get as much money to their families too. Do you have any figures on how much money people are sending back to Eritrea, and then like what is being fined?
Yes. So on your first point, yes, people have enormous issues. Once they come from, there have been Eritrean refugees who arrive in Italy and promptly die of starvation after their experiences in Libya. So people have extreme scabies, mental health distress. They've experienced sexual torture. So the range of issues is profound. One of the interesting points I found, though, is that the people I work with, in some ways, their political activism and their friendship kind of inured them. This is just my observation from the worst aspects of the degradation that they face. So it gave them something to work towards, a future, a purpose, and that was something that actually really mitigated against the senseless suffering that many faced. The other thing, the figures, so yes, $50,000 ransoms. The state fines people $3,300, and this is one of the poorest states in Africa, so that's a significant burden to a family. And it's not fining the diasporic family, it's fining people in Eritrea. And the 2% tax, the way that Eritrea's citizenship works is that anyone who has one Eritrean parent is considered an Eritrean citizen. So, for example, I was born in LA. Both of my parents I think my mom was born in Asmara. They were born in Eritrea. If I wanted to go to Eritrea, I'd have to apply for citizenship. I would get it. But then I'd have to pay 2% of my income. There's a number, even though there are a number of Eritreans who are professionals who are well paid. So this 2% tax can be enormous for a state that doesn't really have very much out in its economy other than mining and a few international engagements. I don't have exact figures because the Eritrean government has never published a budget since its inception. So these are just conjectures.
Your very interesting presentation, but it was very much from the perspective of the migrants, looking at the issues of migration. And I guess for me, trying to follow it, it's difficult to understand that without more context, without specifically understanding what is the policy and legal environment that they're operating with. And so I would like I'd like you to go back to your answer to the first question and provide a little bit more context, because I guess I'm particularly concerned about where things are going in Europe now. I mean, not just in neo-black shirt Italy, but also with nativist trends in other countries, with talk about remigration and things of that sort. But then specifically, these new regimes for corralling or exporting migrants, and you alluded to some of them. I mean, so there's the one with Albania, there's the one that was negotiated linked with Rwanda, and I've been involved with extensively with Libya, and I know there were furtive agreements, secretive agreements
in the
done
2000s.
Done both in Tripoli and Benghazi, in which, there was sort of a bounty paid for people who were being held. And all this seems to be sort of behind a curtain, not particularly well highlighted, for good reason, because I think people who become acquainted with what's going on are horrified by it. But I'd be interested in understanding, how do Eritrean migrants interact with that, and what experiences do they have with that regime? That strikes me as something that's really burning.
Yes, thank you so much. So there's so much to say. So you're right, these are often secret deals. I think about it in the terms of their legal instruments. They're done through memorandums of understanding, which are non-binding. They're not international treaties. They circumvent the rule of law. They don't have to go through parliament. And they also make it really hard for migrants to find accountability. So let's say you were tortured in Libya, and you were tortured because the Italian government paid the Libyan government and built, with Italian funds, which is exactly what happened, detention centers that the Italian government, with its full knowledge, knows horrific torture happens. You go to the Court for Human Rights, but because of the way that the MOU functions, they cannot prove culpability. So you have no form of redress as a migrant. And actually many of my interlocutors were instrumental in making the MOU in 2017 public. Nobody had any idea that it existed. It was signed by the Democratic Party of Italy, not the right wing, after the 2015 crisis, because Italians, about 50% of Italians believed there was too much migration. Now, the question of migration is not necessarily easily conveyed by numbers. It's a very emotive issue, and it's often involves a lot of misperceptions. So, for example, in Italy, Italians believe about that 26% of the Italian population is a migrant. That portion is about 8%, and only half of that 8% is migrants who are not from the EU. So there's a huge gulf in perception versus the reality of migration. About 3% of the world's population is migrating at any one time. However, it is a really kind of effective political kind of volleyball that one can play. And the policies, they're very hostile. They're about limiting the number of arrivals. And I've met EU officials who say that they believe that this is because that they need to do this to preserve the European Union, to preserve it against the attacks that the new right has been lobbying. Like one official said, if we don't do this, Viktor Orban will throw a bomb into the entire EU. The interesting thing is that what I've seen is that even as numbers diminish arrivals, this hasn't actually stopped the rise of the right. Which I find to be a really fascinating issue. This hasn't actually reduced the electoral might of the right. And Italy is a country that has been historically a country of emigration, and the Italian economy is contracting. Like, they just need workers, about 100,000 each year to maintain its economy. And immigrants in Italy have the highest rates of employment. They have higher rates than native Italians because they take on the dirty work Italians don't want to do. So if I was totally just economistic and instrumentalist, I'd be like, I'm pro-immigrants because the economy. However, these kinds of issues, they bring up other anxieties for people that it's hard for me to imagine as a child of immigrant, but they're actually really important to understand where are these feelings and misperceptions coming from, and why are they so potent at this particular political moment? So I think that's my short answer. I hope that I did your question justice.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. I guess I'm asking for different kinds of context,
Okay.
And sort of some sense of some of the larger systems that are involved. I was kind of struck by the contrast between the way you set it up in terms of huge scale of migration, and then your interlocutors talking about the tiny scale
Yes.
of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And at one point, I may not get the numbers quite right, but I think you said something like annually that was something like, I don't know, 15,000 people arriving and only 500 staying,
Yes.
something like that.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to sort of get a sense of how that works. I mean, I'm assuming that there are some sort of large NGO organizations that are part of sort of processing and working with migrants, but like, how is it that the tiny cells are making contacts and moving people along? So I'm trying to get a sense of that sort of cross of scales and how you get to just 500 staying. And the other thing that I was wondering is, you know, you're talking about, you know, the largest export of people in the world, many of them, the majority of them, male. So that makes me think of what's going on in Eritrea. Does that mean that the conscription is taking more women or keeping men longer?
Yes.
It's like sort of how does this work both ways?
So everything you've pointed out is wonderful, and unfortunately, this is like a tiny snippet of a book, so I couldn't get into that. But I'll address your 2 points. So the first point that you make about the scale, the issue of scale, is the whole question of ethnography. Like, as anthropologists, this is what we do. We look at these especially anthropologists of migrations. We look at these large-scale phenomenon and look at how they're taking place on the ground, their situated dynamics, which was what I was hoping to do. I'll just say this, this has been a kind of question about the anthropology of Italy and the anthropology of state in Italy, is that the Italian state is experienced as kind of capricious, it's experienced as fragmented, and one thing I did hear, so there were Eritrean activist networks that had a radio, and they would tell you where the border was open and where it was closed. You found out whose phone number could help you. Father Mousse Zarai, who was the nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014, he's Eritrean. He had an NGO where people, literally their boat was sinking, would call his cell phone and he would direct them to the Coast Guard in Italy. So people actually organically had formed these networks. And then one thing I was also told is that, first of all, these are not detention centers. When you arrive as a refugee, you can leave. But if you get your fingerprints taken, you have to remain in Italy. So Italian authorities were also kind of looking the other way as Eritreans left, which was something both Eritreans and Italians told me. So there was a kind of, if you think about it, on a large scale, there was people were facilitating movement, but for different reasons. Italians because they don't want to keep refugees, Eritreans because they didn't want to stay in Italy. But the EU clamped down on that. And then the other question you have about women. So I had a whole long interlude about the situation of women. Women are also conscripted to military service, and women actually fought in the war in Eritrea. I'll show you the image. This image is like an iconic image. 30% of the fighters in Eritrea's war for independence were women. And actually, if you know the author Stieg Larsson, the Swedish anarchist, he actually went to Eritrea and trained women how to use ballistics missiles for a year, which is an interesting little tidbit. But women, so because women served as frontline combatants, there's part of the problem of Eritrea is also that the state wants to repeat the past ritualistically over and over again, which is why you have this large-scale conscription. For women, it's been very difficult. Women experience sexual violence in conscription. The only way that they can avoid conscription is by marrying and having children. But if they do that, that means that they don't have the paperwork, no ability to work, no exit visas, nothing. So in fact, partly what I wrote is that this creates a situation also where women are, women's status has fundamentally degraded in Eritrean society because of military service. But also women are sexually abused, they experience sexual violence en route in such high rates that families don't want women to take on that risk. So the idea is that men go, and when men get legal status, they can apply for family reunification. But that's also proving much more difficult than it did in the past. So at first I had it in the chapter, but it's also, there's a question of, it's not just family fragmentation, there's huge separations between men and women. Married couples can't ever live together. And that is also a consequence both of the policies of the Eritrean regime, but also EU family reunification laws. Okay, I hope that answered your question.
Any other questions? Please join me in thanking Dr. Berhane for a great talk.